Elijah Thompson, a black man in his 40s, had just finished a long day at the office. As the Minister of Justice, his job was often demanding, but tonight, he decided to take a little time for himself. Changing into his workout gear, he laced up his running shoes and stepped outside, inhaling the crisp air of his quiet suburban neighborhood. The brick-paved path stretched out under the dim glow of streetlights. The sound of rustling leaves accompanied Elijah's every stride. He cherished moments like these, where he could set aside the weight of responsibility and focus solely on the rhythm of his body and mind. As he jogged past a small park, Elijah was unaware of the cold, calculating eyes watching him from a parked police car at the corner. Officer Taylor Mills, alongside his partner John Carter, had been stationed there all evening, patrolling the area. Spotting Elijah, Taylor frowned. "John, look, doesn't he look familiar? I'm pretty sure I've seen that guy in yesterday's robbery description." John hesitated slightly. "You sure? This is a good neighborhood. Night jogging isn't unusual here." Taylor pressed the gas, and the police car began to inch forward. Elijah heard the car stop behind him but didn't turn around. Suddenly, a loud voice rang out. "Stop! Hands up!" He halted and turned to look. Two police officers had stepped out of the car, their expressions filled with suspicion. Taylor, a tall and imposing figure, gripped a flashlight tightly, while John rested his hand on the gun at his hip. "What's the matter, officers?" Elijah asked calmly. Taylor didn't respond immediately. He moved closer, shining the flashlight into Elijah's face. "Who are you? What are you doing out here at this hour?" "I'm just jogging," Elijah replied, a sense of unease starting to creep in. "I live not far from here." Taylor smirked. "Where's your ID?" Elijah frowned. "I didn't bring it. I just stepped out for a run. I didn't think I'd need to carry ID." John, standing behind Taylor, muttered, "Taylor, maybe this isn't necessary." But Taylor ignored him, stepping even closer, his gaze probing. "You look exactly like a suspect in a robbery. Are you sure you're not hiding something?" Elijah held his composure. "Officer, I don't know anything about any robbery, but if you need to verify my identity, I'm willing to cooperate." Without waiting for further explanation, Taylor motioned for Elijah to turn around and place his hands on his head. Elijah complied, though a wave of humiliation swept over him as Taylor began to pat him down. "Nothing here," John said. "Maybe he's got nothing to do with this." Taylor shook his head. "Better safe than sorry. Let's take him to the station." Elijah was handcuffed and escorted to the police station. On the way, Taylor couldn't resist throwing a few mocking remarks. "Jogging? Huh? What are you? Training for the Olympics?" Elijah remained silent, his gaze fixed ahead. He knew any reaction would only worsen the situation. At the station, the humiliation continued. Taylor led Elijah into a small room, forcing him to sit on a cold metal chair. Other officers began to gather at the door, peering in with a mix of curiosity and derision. "Speak up. What were you doing there at that time?" Taylor demanded, his voice full of challenge. Elijah took a deep breath. "I already told you. I was jogging. If you check, I'm sure this will be cleared up." Taylor sneered. "Cleared up? Who do you think you are, a lawyer?" Another officer entered, holding a cup of coffee. "Taylor, something's off. This guy looks familiar." Taylor waved him off dismissively. "Don't tell me you're scared of some jogger." Elijah raised his head, his eyes steady. "You should check again. I am Elijah Thompson, the Minister of Justice." The room fell silent. Taylor's eyes widened as he stared at Elijah in disbelief. "Who do you think you are? Making up stories like that?" Elijah maintained his calm demeanor. "Call the federal government office and verify." A young officer hesitated but took out his phone. A few minutes later, the room erupted in chaos as the information was confirmed. Taylor and his colleagues turned pale. One of them tried to persuade Elijah not to report the incident, but Elijah quietly stood up. removing the handcuffs. "I won't let this go. Not for myself, but for others, those who don't have a voice," Elijah said, his tone deep and resolute, yet powerful. That night, a video recorded by a passerby showing Taylor searching and humiliating Elijah went viral on social media. By the next morning, the incident dominated the news. Elijah Thompson's name became the center of attention, not only because he was the minister of justice, but because his story symbolized the injustices many Black people endure daily. The nation became divided. Some demanded justice and accountability for abuse of power, while others defended Taylor, claiming he was simply doing his job. Taylor was temporarily suspended from duty, but he was far from at peace. Inside him, a simmering anger and a sense of betrayal began to grow, like a small flame waiting to ignite. Elijah, though weary and hurt, rose with strength. He knew this was just the beginning of a long battle ahead. The next day, the story of Elijah Thompson, the U.S. Attorney General, being racially profiled and harassed by police became the leading headline across all media outlets. Major news networks ran continuous coverage, and social media was flooded with posts, photos, and the video recorded by a passerby. The story quickly spread internationally, becoming a new symbol for the anti-racism movement. In his office, Elijah felt conflicted. On one hand, he knew his story could inspire change, but on the other, he dreaded the disruption it might bring to his personal life and family. Sitting across from him was Rachel, his wife, a seasoned journalist. Rachel clasped Elijah's hands tightly. "Elijah, you can't stay silent. This is your chance to do something monumental, not just for yourself, but for millions of others." Elijah nodded. He knew she was right. Picking up his phone, he called his legal team. "Start an independent investigation," he said. "I want everything to be transparent and above board." Meanwhile, at the police department, Taylor Mills, the officer who had harassed Elijah, was summoned to give an explanation. The atmosphere in the conference room was tense as Taylor faced senior leadership. He tried to justify his actions, claiming he was just doing his job. But the video told a different story. "You've embarrassed the entire police force," one senior officer barked. "Suspension is the least severe punishment you'll face." Taylor left the room seething with anger. He didn't believe he had done anything wrong. Deep down, Taylor thought Elijah was just a lucky Black man, leveraging his power to ruin his career. A week later, Elijah officially announced that he would initiate an independent investigation into the incident, not only focusing on Taylor Mills' actions but also on the entire police system in the region. This wasn't the first investigation into racial profiling within law enforcement, but it held special significance as it was led by a victim who also happened to be the nation's Attorney General. Elijah and his legal team held a press conference. Stepping up to the podium, his gaze was confident, and his voice resolute. "What happened to me was not an isolated incident. It reflects a systemic issue that has persisted for far too long. I stand here today not to seek revenge, but to demand justice and to inspire hope that we can bring about real change." The press conference immediately sparked a wave of support from the public, particularly from those who had experienced similar injustices. Human rights organizations, social activists, and numerous politicians voiced their backing for Elijah. Meanwhile, Taylor found himself under mounting pressure. Friends and colleagues who had once been close to him now began to distance themselves. Even his family wasn't spared from public scrutiny. His wife, Linda, started to have doubts, while their children asked difficult questions. "Dad, did you really do that?" The investigation quickly gathered substantial evidence. In addition to the passerby's video, Elijah's legal team obtained footage from the body cameras worn by Taylor and John. The images and audio clearly revealed Taylor's hostile attitude from the outset. The investigation didn't stop there. It uncovered a series of past misconduct by Taylor. Local residents, who had previously stayed silent out of fear, began to speak up. They recounted incidents where Taylor used excessive force, stopped black individuals without cause, and even made threats. Elijah and his team started compiling an extensive case, not only against Taylor but also targeting the system that had enabled such behavior. The media continued its coverage, intensifying the pressure on the police department. However, not everyone sided with Elijah. Some police organizations spoke out in defense of Taylor, claiming he was merely a victim of the media and accusing Elijah of abusing his power. The controversy deepened, further dividing public opinion. Elijah was invited to participate in a live interview on a national television network. This was his chance to share his story and clarify the purpose of the investigation. Sitting before the camera, Elijah began recounting the incident, detail by detail, emotion by emotion. He spoke about the humiliation of being handcuffed, the anger of being treated as a criminal simply because of his skin color, and the pain of realizing this was far from an isolated incident. "I am not here to destroy anyone," Elijah said, his gaze firm. "I am here to say that we cannot continue to live in a society where justice is distorted by prejudice." His words resonated across the nation. Many viewers were moved to tears, feeling as though someone was finally standing up for them. The interview became a significant turning point, not only for the investigation but also for the broader movement for justice. Elijah knew this was just the first step. The road ahead would be long, but he was determined to fight to the end. The investigation into Taylor's conduct and the systemic issues within the police force grew increasingly intense. The nation became deeply divided. Many sided with Elijah, viewing him as a symbol of justice and a champion for the oppressed. Others, particularly within police ranks, saw Taylor as a victim of a political campaign. During his suspension, Taylor became more unstable. He received hundreds of emails and messages, ranging from support from conservative groups to threats and harsh criticism. Sitting alone in his small home with a bottle of whiskey, his eyes bloodshot, Taylor grappled with his emotions. Meanwhile, at the Department of Justice, Elijah and his team worked tirelessly to build a comprehensive case. One of his lawyers, Rachel, presented their findings. "We have enough evidence to prove Taylor's misconduct. But the bigger priority is exposing the flaws in the system. This isn't just about one person. It's about an entire mechanism." Elijah nodded, his eyes filled with determination. "Exactly. This isn't just about seeking justice for me. It's about justice for everyone who has ever endured this kind of injustice." The next day, Elijah received a call from a prominent investigative journalist. The journalist revealed information about an internal email from the police department, exposing that Taylor had been accused of racial discrimination multiple times but had always been shielded by the system. Finally, the hearing at the federal court was held. Elijah, as both a witness and a victim, entered the courtroom under the watchful eyes of hundreds, media, family members, and the public. Taylor, seated at the defendant's table, looked nothing like his usual arrogant self. Dressed in a wrinkled suit, his face was pale. His lawyer tried to argue that Taylor's actions were a result of job-related stress and that he had not intentionally acted out of racial bias. Elijah took the witness stand. With a calm, steady voice and carefully chosen words, he recounted the events of that night in detail. However, instead of focusing on blaming Taylor personally, he shifted the narrative to broader issues. "I am not here seeking revenge. I am here demanding justice not just for myself, but for everyone who has ever been subjected to abuse of power because of the color of their skin. This is not the fault of one individual. It is the consequence of a broken system that remains unaddressed." Evidence from the video, witness testimonies, and Taylor's prior records were presented. Each piece of evidence landed like a sharp blade, cutting through Taylor's weak defense. In the audience, Angela, Elijah's wife, quietly held their young daughter's hand, her eyes filled with pride. She knew her husband was fighting not just for himself, but for a better future for all. As evidence continued to be presented, another shocking truth came to light. Internal emails provided by the investigative journalist revealed that the police department had deliberately covered up Taylor's misconduct for years. Several senior officers had either turned a blind eye or actively erased records to protect the department's image. During the trial, Elijah posed a powerful question. If someone like me, with my position and power, can be humiliated and treated unjustly, how much worse must it be for those without a voice? This is not about one person's story. This is about a system that must be changed. His words brought the courtroom to a standstill. Even Taylor, who had been defiant throughout, lowered his head in silence, unable to respond. Outside the courtroom, nationwide protests in support of Elijah erupted. People of color and other marginalized communities held signs and chanted slogans demanding police reform. Prominent human rights organizations also joined the call, urging the government to take immediate action. After days of mounting pressure, Taylor finally broke down. During a hearing, he stood up, his voice trembling. I was wrong. I acted unfairly, unprofessionally, and I take responsibility for that. But I didn't do this alone. The system taught me that suspicion and prejudice were the only ways to ensure safety. I'm just one link in a chain of mistakes. Taylor's confession sent shockwaves through the courtroom. While it didn't earn him immediate forgiveness, his words sparked a deeper conversation about the urgent need for systemic reform. Elijah, sitting across from Taylor, looked at him for a long moment before responding. Your apology is a first step, but it's not enough. What we need is action to ensure no one else has to endure this. Following the trial, Elijah was interviewed by a prominent journalist. When asked if he felt any hatred, Elijah replied, "Hatred won't take us far. What I want to see is change. Not just in the laws, but in the hearts and minds of people." After the trial, Taylor's confession sparked intense reactions within the community. Media outlets everywhere dissected his every word. From his admission of wrongdoing to his implication that the police system itself was at the root of these problems. Though Elijah had stepped out of the courtroom, he was still faced with larger questions. How do we fix this system? How do we prevent similar incidents in the future? At a conference organized by the Department of Justice, Elijah stood before hundreds of attendees, including lawmakers, human rights organizations, and several high-ranking police officers. His speech was not just a call for reform but also a wake-up call. Imagine a country where our children can grow up without fearing the very people entrusted to protect them. That is the dream we are working toward. But to achieve that, we must act, starting now. The conference ignited a wave of support for police reform. Many attendees, including younger officers, spoke up about the challenges they faced in confronting internal issues. A young officer named Marcus shared his experience. I've witnessed misconduct within my unit, but I was too afraid to speak out. Now I understand that silence is also part of the problem. Marcus became one of the faces representing a new generation of officers, those who wanted to see positive change from within the system. As Elijah continued to advocate for systemic change at the highest levels, the movement for police reform spread across the nation. Peaceful protests took place in numerous cities, with tens of thousands of people from all walks of life joining in. Signs bearing slogans like "Justice for All" and "End Abuse of Power" appeared everywhere. Elijah participated in a massive march in Washington, D.C. The crowd stretched for miles, each person carrying the hope of a brighter future. At the central square, Elijah took the microphone, his voice resonating with emotion. Today, we are not just demanding change, we are building it. Every step you take, every chant you raise is a testament to the power of unity and justice. Meanwhile, at the police department where Taylor had worked, some officers began pushing back against the current policies. A small group, led by John Carter, called for mandatory training on racial equity and accountability. They faced resistance from some colleagues, but the support from the broader community fueled their determination to press on. Despite the strong support for reform, Elijah and his allies faced significant challenges in the political arena. Some conservative lawmakers argued that the proposed reforms were too extreme and could weaken law enforcement. At a congressional session, Elijah presented a draft bill for police reform. The proposal included key measures such as enhanced training on equality and anti-discrimination practices, implementation of an independent oversight system to investigate misconduct allegations, establishing national standards for the use of force. The session was tense. Some lawmakers strongly opposed the draft, questioning, how can we ensure these changes won't undermine national security? Elijah responded candidly, security should never be an excuse to overlook justice. If our system cannot protect everyone equally, it has already failed. Despite the resistance, Elijah gained support from several progressive lawmakers who pledged to help push the bill through. After months of struggle, the police reform bill was finally passed in Congress with majority support. The news was widely covered by the media, marking a historic milestone in the fight for equality and justice. At a signing ceremony, Elijah stood beside the president, receiving prolonged applause from the audience. In his speech, he said, "Today, we have taken a significant step forward, but this is not the destination. Justice is a journey, and I hope each of us will continue walking this path together." Taylor, now serving his sentence in prison, watched the ceremony on a small screen in his cell. A single tear rolled down his cheek. Though bitter, he understood that this event had brought about something far greater than his personal mistakes. When Elijah returned home, he found Angela and their young daughter waiting for him with bright smiles. The little girl ran up to him and hugged him tightly. "Daddy, you're my hero." Elijah laughed, lifting her into his arms. "No, sweetheart. The heroes are all the people who stood up for justice. I'm just doing my part." The story closes this chapter with a beacon of hope, but also opens the door to a future filled with challenges to uphold and build upon the changes achieved. The passing of the police reform law was a major victory, but for Elijah, it was only the first step in a long journey. The new reforms needed to be implemented in practice, which required not only changes to the law but also a shift in the mindset of those enforcing it. Elijah organized a series of national workshops, inviting human rights experts, young police officers, and individuals who had been victims of discrimination to participate. At a workshop in Chicago, a young officer named Lisa shared her story. "I used to think that being tough on people of color was just part of the job. But now I understand that our duty isn't just to protect the community. It's to protect their trust in the system." Stories like Lisa's gave Elijah hope. He knew change couldn't happen overnight, but each person like Lisa was a small light shining through the darkness of prejudice. Meanwhile, law enforcement agencies began implementing changes mandated by the new law. Several cities piloted independent oversight programs, where civilian groups were given the authority to review allegations of police misconduct. Although these initiatives faced resistance, they fostered a more transparent environment and set the stage for lasting reform. While the reform law was widely celebrated, some extremist conservative groups continued to criticize Elijah and his allies. On social media, baseless accusations began to spread. Some articles even slandered Elijah, claiming he was abusing his power to enforce reverse discrimination against white people. Elijah understood that this battle wasn't just fought in courts or legislatures. It was also a fight for the hearts and minds of the public. In a live television interview, he directly faced critical questions. "Do you think you're dividing the country by pushing these reforms?" Elijah responded, "I'm not dividing the country. I'm trying to heal it. We cannot have unity without justice. Justice is not a privilege. It's a fundamental right for everyone." Meanwhile, Taylor Mills, from within his prison cell, began keeping a journal about his past mistakes. He hoped his story could serve as a lesson for others. One day, he sent a long letter to Elijah's office, apologizing and pledging to support the reform movement in any way he could. Elijah read the letter in silence. While forgiveness didn't come easily, he recognized the sincerity in Taylor's words. he decided to write back, encouraging Taylor to continue improving himself and contributing to positive change. A year after the reform law was passed, the initial results became evident. Widespread implementation of training programs on equality and accountability led to noticeable changes. In areas where the reforms were adopted, complaints about police misconduct dropped significantly. Elijah attended a graduation ceremony at the National Police Academy, where young officers had just completed the first course under the reformed curriculum. A young black recruit stood up and shared, "I used to be afraid of becoming a police officer because of the social stigma, but thanks to the recent changes, I now feel proud to be part of building trust in my community." The ceremony was filled with applause and hope. Elijah felt a sense of relief in his heart. He knew there was still much work to be done, but seeing the passionate, young faces before him reassured him that real change was possible. Additionally, communities that had previously been affected by police violence began to feel safer. People like Mrs. Mary, the mother of Jamal, stepped outside at night for the first time in years without fear. She sent a letter of gratitude to Elijah. "Thank you for turning your pain into strength to protect people like us." 2 years after the fateful incident, Elijah was invited to speak at the United Nations during a conference on human rights and judicial reform. Standing before representatives from dozens of nations, he shared his story, emphasizing that justice is not a privilege for a select few but the foundation of a sustainable society. Upon returning home from his trip, Elijah stepped into the living room, where Angela and their daughter were waiting. They embraced him tightly. Angela looked at him, her eyes filled with pride. "You've done what very few dare to do, Elijah. You've changed an entire system." Elijah smiled and replied, "It wasn't just me. It was thanks to everyone who stood up for justice. I'm just one of them." From the living room window, Elijah gazed outside. The morning sunlight filtered through the trees, signaling a new beginning. He knew his work wasn't finished, but today, he could smile, knowing he had helped create a better world for his daughter's generation and many others.